Welcome everyone to this installment of the Delta on the Move lecture series here at the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences. I'm Ghassan Moazin, and as is already in the name, this lecture series is part of a new project we're running here at the Institute called Delta on the Move, the historical development of the Greater Bay Area. And I'm also joined here today by Dr. John Wong, who is the PI of that project. Now, today we're very happy to welcome to the webinar, or to the seminar rather, to the lecture series, Professor Xing from Brandeis University. Professor Han received his doctorate degree from the University of California in Berkeley. And he's the author of a, I think by now very well-known book, Conflict and Commerce in Maritime East Asia, the Xing Family and the Shaping of the Modern World, 1620 to 1720. And he also co-edited recently a volume with Tonya Andrade, Sea Rover, Silver and Samurai, Maritime East Asia and Global History, 1550 to 1700. And today, Professor Han is going to talk to us about some of his ongoing research. And his talk is entitled Situating Space Through Verse, a study of the 10 verses of Tian by Tianci. Now, before I hand things over, just a brief word about the format. So Professor Han is going to speak for around 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A button in Zoom, and I will then read them out to Professor Han for him to reply. So if you're ready, Xing, please feel free to start.
Sure, yeah. So thank you so much, Ghassan, for the introduction, and thank you, John, for coordinating everything and this entire project. And it's actually great to be here and to share with you part of my work in progress of the book that I'm actually working on. So I'm gonna pull up the PowerPoint.
Yes, yeah.
So do I share the screen?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay, so all right, let me just pull it up here. Okay. So the title of my talk is Situating Space Through Verse, a study of the 10 verses of Tian. And before we go into that, so this talk essentially looks at an anthology of poetry that was compiled by Tianci, who was the garrison commander or the leader of the Chinese Creole polity of Tian during the 18th century. And it wasn't just him who wrote the 10 verses, but he was joined by many other elites in Qing China, as well as Vietnam. And this is the anthology we're going to be looking at today. Just a little background about Tian. Today, it is a relative backwater, a small city on the border of Vietnam and Cambodia. It belongs to Vietnam, but it's about 20 kilometers from the Cambodian border. But during the 18th century, a Chinese family actually established themselves there. And they conducted trade and also political as well as military expansion. And they played big power politics, in particular with Vietnam, Cambodia, as well as Siam. Now, the area that is Tian used to belong to Cambodia. It was a Cambodian province. And during the late 17th century, about the time of the Ming-Qing transition, an individual who was from the Leizhou Peninsula in what is today Western Guangdong. It's that peninsula right opposite Hainan Island. And this individual was named Mo Zhou. And Mo Zhou was a Ming loyalist. He refused to serve the Qing. And he actually ended up abroad. He conducted a lot of trade, maybe first of all with Manila, and then he ended up in Cambodia. And he gained the trust of the Cambodian king and eventually acquired from him a plot of land on sort of the southeastern frontier of the Khmer Empire. And that became Hatien. Now, the actual story is a lot more complex, but we'll just leave it at that. Now, Mojo married either a Vietnamese or a Cambodian woman. I'm still looking into this, actually. But their son was named Mo Tianci. And Mo Tianci took over the leadership of Hatien in 1735. And he essentially ruled over the area for the next 3 to 4 decades. So it's a very long reign. And in the process, Mojo diversified his options. So he started out as a kind of subject of Cambodia. He became more and more independent. And in order to acquire more independence, he paid tribute to the southern Vietnamese regime of Cochin China under the Nguyen lords. So he sent envoys to Hue, the Cochin Chinese capital, and said he wanted to become a vassal of Cochin China. And eventually, Hatien expanded its connections even beyond these two powers, with Siam, with Qing China, as well as Japan. And the cornerstone of Hatien was, in fact, trade. And this is what allowed it to gain such an important position in maritime East Asia during the 18th century. And it also underpinned its independence to a large extent. One prominent export of Hatien involved natural resources. So rice, timber, things of that nature that were exported in large numbers to commercial cores in Vietnam, China, as well as Japan. In addition, Hatien, over the course of the 18th century, especially after 1750, it increasingly became a transshipment point. It was a place where mainland and island Southeast Asia met. It was also a place that connected Southeast Asia with the world of China and Japan farther to the north. So items like tea, tin, these things, coming from China as well as island Southeast Asia, a lot of these items first congregated in Hatien before going to their respective destinations. Another major item that was traded, in fact, consisted of Chinese laborers, because there was a natural resource shortage in China, increasing population. So many Chinese actually, were sent in large numbers to island Southeast Asia, mainland Southeast Asia to work the mines. And Hatien was very involved in that trade as well. So I'm giving you a sense of the kind of economic importance that this place occupied in the 18th century. Okay, so moving forward, let me just skip one slide here. And Mo Tianci is actually the person that we're going to concentrate on. And Mo Tianci assumed the leadership of Hatien in 1735. And he actually built upon the foundations of his father. So he opened up new land, he organized government, he expanded trade. But one of the things that he was most well known for was starting a literary society. So this was a society that would meet together to compose poetry as well as prose, compiling anthologies together. And so in many ways, Mo Tianci was a man of culture. And this part has actually been covered by a lot of authors, both Vietnamese as well as people outside of Vietnam. In fact, the most recent study of Hatien by Claudine Ang of Yale and US Singapore, she actually wrote her work looking at Mo Tianzi's poetry. But anyways, so he started a literary society that was known as the Hall of Summoning Worthies, otherwise known as the Zhao Ying Ge. And the location of the Hall of Summoning Worthies has actually been determined by a local Hatien-based scholar named Jun Min Dat. And he actually did very detailed studies of linguistics and geography. And he determined that the Hall of Summoning Worthies is actually located on the grounds of a Buddhist temple that is today known as the Fuzhong Pagoda. And this was the former site of the Hall of Summoning Worthies. And most likely, this hall wasn't really a hall or a building of any sort, but it was probably an open space or an open air pavilion where literary figures could meet and kind of compose poetry together, giving a kind of inspiration at the natural world around them. This Fuzhong Pagoda is actually located on the slopes of Screen Mountain, Binsan. And this mountain actually lies to the west of the Hatien city center. And it's a very historically significant site. In fact, the cemetery of the Mo leaders and key commanders and officials are also located there. So they got together here and they composed poetry. Oh, and another thing is that in the back of this temple actually lies a Taoist shrine to the Jade Emperor. And actually, I think the Taoist shrine precedes the Buddhist temple. And it would make a lot of sense that they might use the grounds or the courtyard of the Taoist temple to compose poetry. I mean, if you look at literary societies in Guangzhou, for instance, that's how they did it. I mean, there's a lot of Taoist themes that come through in the poetry of Canton-based poets. So moving forward, so this is Mo Tianzi's introduction to the 10 verses of Hatien. And he's basically talking about one key purpose of why he decided to start this literary society. And this was to bring civilization or to transform Hatien, which was once a kind of barbarian outpost or remote place, and to transform it into a bastion of traditional Chinese civilization. So he wanted to found a kind of Chinese utopia in Hatien. And this is an argument that's made by Claudine Ong, as well as Chen Jinghe, who's a very famous Vietnamese history specialist. And I think they're absolutely correct. So essentially what happened was that, there was a merchant from Guangzhou. His name was Chen Zhikai. And he was a merchant who sailed to many parts of the South China Sea. And he was also a man of culture. He was very well connected with elites in Qing China as well as Vietnam. These are the places where he frequently visited. And he would actually get together with Mo Tianzi, staying for several months at a time, and they would drink together as well as compose poetry. And it was at the advice of Chen Zhikai that Mo Tianzi, or maybe Mo Tianzi wanted to do so in the first place, but they got this idea of choosing 10 of the most prominent scenic views of Hatien and writing poetry about them. So Mo Tianzi started with his own set of 10 poems about each of the 10 scenes, and then he would be joined by other poets who came from China as well as Vietnam, from across the maritime East Asian world. And so the 10 scenes of Hatien that he and Chen Zhikai picked, I'll just go over it with you one by one. The first is entitled Golden Islet Blocking Tempests. And the golden islet actually refers to an island in the river mouth of Hatien. Today, land reclamation and everything have made this, this island a part of the mainland, but it used to be an island lying at the river mouth, and it was a very natural defensive fortification that guarded Hatien, shielded Hatien from foreign invaders as well as natural calamities such as very dangerous waves or tempests. So hence the title, Golden Islet Blocking Tempest. And then second is Screen Mountain's Emerald Folds. So I talked to you about Screen Mountain. It's where the clan cemetery was. It's also the location of the Fuzhong Pagoda. And it has a lot of lush vegetation as well as trees. So yeah, it's very beautiful, and it's shaped like an unfolded screen with many different peaks. So hence the name. Temple Bell at Dawn. And this is actually Mo Tianci writing about a temple that was located around a kilometer west of the city center. And every morning the bells would ring and the entire city could hear it. And so he wrote about the Temple Bell at Dawn. Night Drum of the River Fortress. So the River Fortress is essentially, let me just move to the next slide quickly. So this is actually the river mouth of Hatien, where the sea meets the port. And if you go further in, that is a river that goes all the way up into Cambodia. And it's called the Jiangchen River, which translated essentially means fortress river. Or, with Vietnamese, right, you put the noun before the adjective, if you flip it around, it could be kind of like a river fortress of sorts, right? So there was a fortress that was established there to kind of guard the borders with the rest of Cambodia, so that Cambodian forces or the Siamese, who are the allies of the Cambodians, won't attack Hatien, which they did on several occasions. So it's just basically talking about guards at night watching over the border. Stone Grotto Swallows Clouds. This is the Shidong, or the Tapdong. It's actually a stone. It's a piece of stone jutting out of an otherwise flat landscape. And it's located to the west of the Hatien city center, about 3 kilometers from the Cambodian border. And the Stone Grotto is actually very famous if you're familiar with the history of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. Actually, this part of history might not be that well known, but Pol Pot actually launched an attack into the Vietnamese side of the border, and his forces actually went to Stone Grotto and massacred a lot of the Vietnamese population there. Egret descending from Pearl Cliff. Pearl Cliff refers to another strange rock formation far to the northwest of the Hatien city center, again, very close to the current Cambodian border. East Lake Mirroring the Moon. This is East Lake. This is the large body of water that leads into the Fortress River. And this large body of water is, strictly speaking, not a lake, but rather a lagoon. And there are certain parts of the year when the fresh water from the Fortress River would flow in, and so the water would be fresh. During other times, the tides of the sea would come in and give this water more of a kind of salty taste. So this is East Lake. East Lake Mirroring the Moon is actually a very purposeful kind of allusion to the West Lake of Hangzhou. And if you look at the Chinese, Donghu Yingyue, in the West Lake of Hangzhou, there is a Santan Yingyue, which is a very famous landscape of West Lake. So a lot of Chinese political allusions from Chinese history, and different sites inside China. South Bay's limpid waves. This talks about a bay about 13 kilometers to the east of Hatien, in what is today Tianlong, and it's a place with very pristine beaches. But during Mo Tianzi's time, there were a lot of trading vessels as well as fishing boats. Deer Cape today is a place in Hatien known as Mui Nai. And Mui Nai today is well, it used to be, and now it's the pandemic. It used to be a popular vacation resort, beaches, but this used to be a Cambodian or Khmer village. And Mo Tianzi actually describes the rich landscape there, including a young child on top of a water buffalo, to kind of end this poem. And then finally, anchored fishing boat at Sea Bass Creek describes a fisherman kind of fishing in a creek that actually extends around where Fortress River and East Lake meet. So there's like a creek that's now a canal that runs straight through to the east. And because seawater occasionally gets into East Lake, this means a lot of sea fish would swim into the canal and making for a very easy catch for fishermen. So Luxi is a very famous fishing village even today. In fact, the prominent Hatien local historian, Chun Min Dat, he's a native of Sea Bass Creek. Okay, so it becomes very apparent what Mo Tianzi is trying to do here with his poems. He is trying to create or transform Hatien into a new bastion of civilization. So he's doing so through poetry, by cultivating these landscapes, domesticating them, but in some ways he's also acting upon the precedents of his father, Mojo. In fact, when Mojo came to Hatien, he started naming a lot of the locations in Hatien according to Chinese place names and historical allusions. So East Lake is a very obvious example, right? This kind of allusion to West Lake. In fact, Chun Min Dat, one of his arguments was that if you look at the poetry of Bai Juyi, the Tang poet Bai Juyi, and he wrote a poem called Changhen Ge, the name Hatien actually derives from passages in the Changhen Ge, where Bai talks about, Xianren, wandering to different parts of the world. And another historical allusion to Hatien comes from, the 8 immortals crossing the sea, 八仙过海. And there's actually one immortal who was a female, and her name is He Xian Gu, He Xian Hatien. Right, so drawing inspiration from ancient Chinese history. And then also look at this mountain here in East Lake. This mountain, I'm not even going to try the Vietnamese pronunciation because I'm going to screw it up majorly bad, but it's called Suzhou Mountain, Suzhou, right? So this is conscious allusion to the scenic views of Jiangnan. Okay, and then for Mo Tianzi, and undoubtedly Mojo, their idealized Chinese utopia in Hatien was undoubtedly a Ming one. So a Ming kind of imagination. And once again, I have to give credit to Claudine Ang, because she's analyzed his poems in great detail. And one literary device that Mo Tianzi uses in his poetry is the strategic positioning of characters to indicate his political affiliation. And it could be describing the scenery at first glance, but if you look at the words, you could read it in a different manner, right? So a kind of pun on words. So this is Mo Tianzi's poem, Golden Eyelid Blocking Waves. And this is actually the Golden Islet right here. You know, a lot of buildings on it. It doesn't really seem impressive at all today, but according to him, the power of waves and tempests are cut off in the southeastern seas by this Golden Islet. And then look at this. The radiance of the sun and moon permeates the sky above and below. If you put sun and moon together, it makes Ming. So you can think about Mo Tianci as really idealizing Tian as under the Ming heaven or under the Ming sky. Right? Okay, so you know, evidence of Ming loyalism and the Ming loyalist character of Tian can be found in a lot of places. And the most obvious place, in fact, is to go to the cemetery on Screen Mountain and to look at the tombstones and what are the inscriptions within them. And so here you can see Mo Tianci's wife, Lady Wen. And if you look at what precedes like her epigraphic inscription, it says Huang Ming. So this means Imperial Ming, identifying her as a subject of the Ming, which is really interesting because Lady Wen was probably Vietnamese, although we're not sure because Ryan is also, you know, pretty common surname in Guangdong as well. But you see Huang Ming here, and then all of Mo Tianci's sons who were alive at the time. I mean, he probably had more sons as time went by, but his sons carved this tombstone. And this is a clear sign that, you know, at least into the third generation of Chinese settlers in Hatien, the Ming loyalist memory remains very much alive and well. Now, of course, the main leaders of the Mo clan are far more ambiguous about their affiliation. So if you look at Mojo's tomb right here, I think a lot of people would really pay attention to the characters Long Fei. And Long Fei, you know, Claudine Salmon, as well as many other scholars have equated Long Fei with Ming loyalism. And this is like, you know, a kind of Ming loyalist message of defiance, which it could be, but Long Fei is far more a very ambiguous message because Long Fei essentially means the reigning emperor or whichever emperor is reigning at the time. So he could be referring to the dead Ming emperor. He could be referring to the Vietnamese king. He could be referring to the Qing emperor. He could be referring to anyone, right? And then also look at this. This is what I found very, very strange, which is Gao Feng, these two characters. And Gao Feng essentially means by imperial conferment. But the question is, which imperial conferment? I mean, who's the emperor doing the conferral? And then also this thing here, 镇国, right? A person who stabilizes the country. The question is, which country? And this is not just the tomb right here, actually, as a matter of fact. I looked at memorials from Mo Tianci to the Qing emperor, to Qianlong. And the way that Mo Tianci starts out, his memorial is 和先镇 镇国 Congde Hou. So, you know, the Congde Marquis of Hatien garrison, the stabilizer of the country. But the question is, which country, right? So this is an ambiguity. I don't think I'll have enough time to go into it because we need to talk about other things, but this ambiguity is what really characterizes Hatien. That's their public stance, is to be entirely non-committal. Anyways, I've said enough about Mo Tianci's agenda and kind of his motivations and his poems. What I really want to do is to look at some of the other people who contributed to the anthology series of the 10 verses of Hatien. So altogether, there were 31 contributors. I mean 32 if you count Mo Tianci, right? And so making altogether 320 poems. Now each of these poets, when they write their names, they would precede them with, what their hometown is, what their native place is. So through that, we've identified 23 Chinese, mostly from Fujian and Guangdong, 8 Vietnamese. Now 5 of them had roots in northern Vietnam, in Tonkin. They may have migrated to the south, to Cochin, China, we don't know. But it makes sense because, northern Vietnam was the center of elite culture and Chinese classical tradition. One of them came from Cochin, China, the Vietnamese regime under the Nguyen. And then 2 of them identified themselves as Minh Huân. And Minh Huân essentially means Ming incense. It's a classification given by Cochin, China towards descendants of Ming loyalist immigrants. Although later on, whether you're Ming loyalist or not didn't really matter. It came more to refer to mixed offspring of Chinese and Vietnamese women. Now, we're not really sure how many of these people, okay, so there's a lot of things we're not clear about. We're not clear how many of these Chinese were actually in Qing, China, and how many of them were actually abroad. We're also not clear if these Chinese and Vietnamese were all in Hatien or not. We know that some of them resided locally in Hatien. Some of them resided in the Qing. Some of the Chinese resided in Vietnam. But I think it's safe to say that many of these poems were conducted largely long distance. So the poems circulated through trading vessels. So during the rhythms of the monsoon season, when junks go to China or places farther north, they would carry the poems with them, and then the poets would write their poetry, and then they would send the poems down to Hatien, and that was how these poems were gradually collected and later published. And we actually have good evidence that at least some of them didn't come to Hatien. Zhu Pu, who was one of the contributors, he basically said flat out in one of his poems, "I have yet to ride the winds and come to this land." So a lot of these poets, when they're writing about the 10 scenes of Hatien, they're doing so entirely from their own imagination, which I found to be really interesting as well. And actually, if you look at the different poets and what they're writing, you can find a huge diversity of opinions. And you would think that there would only be a Ming loyalist message, but in fact, it seems that all of the different opinions that were prevalent in maritime East Asia at the time was in fact represented. Now, of course, there were many poets who were completely apolitical. They were just describing the scenery or describing the scenery from their imagination. But there were people who were obviously kind of encoding political messages within their poems. So let's take the example of Ling Weizhe, and his native place is Chaozhou. And we don't know if he's actually in Chaozhou or if he migrated to Vietnam or elsewhere. But he basically wrote Stone Grotto Swallows Clouds, and here's an excerpt here. This is actually the Stone Grotto, by the way, that I'm describing earlier. And he's basically saying, standing watch and waiting until the day the heavens change again. In riotous profusion, we fly over to bathe in the bright river, which, obviously, if you look at Ming and think about the Ming River, you can see that he's definitely waiting for the day that the Ming is going to come back and take over all of heaven. So here's another example from Ling Weizhe as well. Screen Mountain's Emerald Folds, right? So here, Hua Mountain is spiritually efficacious and its land is also fertile. And there's just so many ways we could take this Hua Yue, right? This Hua Mountain. I mean, Hua Mountain is an actual mountain in Shanxi, right, in northwestern China. You could also talk about Huayue as the screen mountain itself, or you can kind of generalize it to say it's a Chinese mountain, right? So it's a very spiritually efficacious place. It's also very fertile. And then look at this next passage. 野马满途飞不到. Right? So you could say that, wild horses filling up an entire road cannot fly over, but this man can also be construed as Manchu, right? And if you look at Screen Mountain, what is it doing, right? It's trying to screen out external invasion. But this is not it. There are some poets who actually write very explicitly. I don't know how more explicit you can get with this pro-Qing message. That, this guy Tong Yucheng, who also comes from Chaozhou, by the way. They're fellow native place people, right? In South-based limpid waves. I don't know, in what other way we could construe this, right? 和仙宁静宋和清. Look at the parallelism here, right? Tian is singing praises to the Qing, right? And then to those who deceive, saying auspicious omens cannot be verified. Here is an indication that China will, for ages onward, be Qing. So he's really just trying to say that the Qing is the master of all under heaven. And actually, it's not that strange. In the cemetery on Screen Mountain, I discovered a lot of tombstones that recognize their occupants as Qing subjects. And the most interesting example I was able to find was of this guy, Mo Bangdi. And Mo Bangdi, this is interesting. I don't know if you can read the characters or not, they're pretty hazy, but he comes from Leizhou, Dongling village. And Dongling village is the native place of the Mo clan. So this is a fellow clansman who has migrated to Hatian, but he identifies himself as a Qing subject, Huang Qing. And then the even more fascinating thing is just check out his wife, a Vietnamese woman, and her tombstone inscription says Huang Yue. She's a Vietnamese subject, right? And you can also see elements of Vietnamese identity coming through in some of these poems. So the poet Chan Chin, who comes from northern Vietnam, at least that's what he claims is his native place. He has this to say about Screen Mountain. Lofty peaks lined up and facing the western capital. Xichao, this is actually talking about Chang'an or Xi'an, resembling a screen placed in front of a beautifully carved window. And the way I interpret this is, China is attractive. It's very beautiful, the beautifully carved window, but there must be a screen placed in front of it, right? There must be a kind of boundary that separates the two countries. And you actually contrast this passage with this one from Sun Tianzhen, who self-identifies as a Minhen, right? And he says that Hatian is like a minister who pays respect to the southern dynasty, to Vietnam, on every side. So Screen Mountain, bows itself towards Vietnam, towards the southern dynasty. And there are also other poems, for instance. I recall one poem that says, the Confucian tablets. I forgot what those are called. They're held by officials during court audiences. But Screen Mountain resembles one of these tablets, and they're held towards the direction of Vietnam. So there's also Vietnamese identity being kind of represented as well. But the thing is, these differences are also not clear cut, because elsewhere, this gets even crazier. You see poets actually talking about the Ming and Qing being friends and having clear spheres of influence of their own. So Lin Weizhe, this guy is really interesting because he also, he's expressing this opinion here, which is 清风明月为知识, right? I mean, the one way you could interpret this is that the Qing and Ming are confidants. They're really great friends. And then 绿水青山作有朋. And this might actually be a kind of a wrong character on the part of the poet or someone who transcribed it. It might be without the water character, so just Qing Shan. But it actually says that, you can think about, Hatien being in charge of the water and the Qing being on the land, and the two can be friends. And this is not just Lin Weizhe. The Vietnamese, Dang Minh Ban, actually says, the massive sailing vessels enter and paint the picture bright or Ming. The Yellow River, according to the omen, should be Qing or should be clear as such. We raise our heads to China afar and sing praises to this great peace. So, this kind of sense that the Ming and Qing can actually coexist, with Hatien being clearly the representative of the Ming. And finally, there are poets speaking about the entire sinosphere, the Chinese-speaking world, as a kind of integrated space. And so Chen Zilan, who I think comes from Fujian, and he basically says that the land of Hatien has now joined Chinese territory. It benefits from the merit of Huo Yao, who chisels away at the stone. And Huo Yao is an allusion to Huo Qubing. And Huo Qubing was a very famous Han Dynasty general who defeated the Xiongnu and expanded the Han Dynasty's realm to the Western regions. And then Chan Chin, the Vietnamese, says, you should know that the Yueshang people frequently pay tribute. The Chinese son of heaven has greater integrity. And what's very interesting is that Chan Chin does not hesitate to call the name of his people, the Vietnamese, by a very archaic term that refers to them as barbarians, in contrast to the Chinese son of heaven. So basically, how much time do we have? Are you almost out? Or? Okay. So basically, when we're looking at the objectives of Mo Tianzi's literary projects, you can think about it as a civilizing mission, right? Trying to graft civilization onto the landscape of Hatien. I'm not going to spend too much time, but there's also a vernacular Vietnamese version that's written in non-characters, so Vietnamese transcribed into Chinese characters. But there's a lot of dispute over its authenticity, and I think that'll probably just be another talk. So let's not go there. But I think this also shows that if it's verified to be from Mo Tianzi, it actually is in line with his effort to spread his message beyond the elite class to the common people, because the non-version will most likely not be written down for people to read, but to be spoken in a kind of storytelling format. So I think that Mo Tianzi what he also wanted to do was goes beyond Hatien. He wanted to forge a transnational ideological commonwealth. He could provide a transnational forum for the expression of ideas that might be deemed controversial or subversive if you're functioning within just the state structure. I mean, if you're functioning, cross-boundary without any kind of state to control what you say, it rapidly expands the freedom of what you're able to express. And I think that's what Mo Tianzi is trying to do. And also, I think he wants to use this to integrate the East Asian space, to smooth over the political differences, because doing so is good for business, right? You decrease the transactional costs, you break down the boundaries, you form a kind of integrated community based upon poetry, based upon Chinese culture. And the bastion of that transnational China is going to be in Hatien. Some of the other things, the 10 verses also forms an instrument of diplomacy. Mo Tianci actually enjoyed a very close friendship with Nguyen Cu Chin, who was the commander of the Cochin Chinese forces in Saigon. And Claudine Ong actually mentions him a lot in her book. So I'm not going to repeat it, but essentially, their friendship was also characterized by a lot of healthy competition, where they basically write letters to each other and compose verses, where Mo Tianci is trying to kind of expand his network or to remove boundaries, whereas Nguyen Cu Chin is trying to territorialize. He's trying to impose Vietnamese control farther into the Mekong River Delta, into Ha Tien, and farther on into Cambodia. So a kind of subtle competition between transnational network versus territorial control. And the way that Mo Tianci went about this expansion and influence, I mean, he certainly had military force. I mean, he had a very powerful military. He had tens of thousands of troops, he had hundreds of ships, but he preferred to do so more by means of capital, and not just cultural capital through the form of poetry, but also money. Okay, so how was Mo Tianci able to get so many people to contribute poems on his behalf? And the simple answer was money. He was able to use Chen Zhikai as an intermediary to connect with the literati in the Guangdong area, in Guangzhou. And money only goes so far, so the majority of the people that he attracted were kind of lower level literati who did not have an official post. But the most prominent of these individuals was a person called She Xitun. And in previous scholarship, the character She is confused with Yu. And Yu is, it's a pretty common Cantonese surname, but it's actually She. And the clan, ancestral clan shrine is located in Shunde. And She Xitun is based there. And what's interesting about She Xitun was that essentially Mo Tianci heavily respected him. And the historical records actually show that he basically used money to buy She Xitun's poems and invited him to write the kind of postscript to the anthology of the 10 verses. Perhaps more typical was an individual here named Liang Luan. And Liang Luan was a very impoverished Cantonese poet. He was single, he barely was able to make a living, but he submitted poems to not the 10 verses, but Mo Tianci also organized several anthologies after the 10 scenes of Ha Tien. And he actually participated in one of these. And Mo Tianci was so impressed with Liang Luan's writing that he actually sent 2 of his officials, Mo Tianci's officials, on board a junk to Guangzhou. And they carried with them a piece of expensive furniture and just gave it to Liang Luan. And Liang was able to sell it on the market for hundreds of pieces of gold. And he was able to live a great life for the rest of his life. So you can see the power of money at work here, right? Beneath these high-sounding principles of Chinese culture, as well as poetry. And the hall of, what is that called? The Zhao Yingge, the hall for summoning worthies, the poetry society that Mo Tianci established. We know for a fact that as late as the 1750s, it was still operating. And there were poets still contributing to the 10 scenes of Ha Tien. Although, those extra poems, we really don't have them today. But let me just close off here. Essentially, in 1756, we read in a local gazetteer that a Shanghai literati by the name of Wang Yukun was invited by Mo Tianci's eldest son, whose name was Mo Huang, and Huang was slated to succeed Mo Tianci. He's like at least the eldest surviving son, and so Mo Hong actually sent a message to Wang asking him, could I be your disciple? And then, of course, giving him a lot of expensive ivory and furniture and all kinds of other things. So once again, here, money talks. And what's very interesting too, I think, is that Mo Tianci bequeathed upon Wang Yuquan, who was supposedly a very famous scholar in the Shanghai area. He bequeathed upon Wang Yuquan the title of Chalponia. And Chalponia, if you're familiar with Cambodian nobility, that's the second highest ranking Cambodian noble title. And so, so it also shows that Mo Tianci maintained very close ties with Cambodia, and and this is something that I won't go into in much detail. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say for my talk. I guess the two key takeaways are poetry, transnational affiliations, and the role of money that drives this entire process. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Xing, for that wonderful talk. So as I said, we now have some time for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please submit them through the Zoom function and through the Q&A function in Zoom, I should say, and then I can read them out, and Professor Han can then reply. But maybe I can start us off. I mean, I'm still sort of fascinated by the whole project particularly because of all the ambiguities that are in there. But I think, so my first question is whether you can talk a bit more about the actual relation between Mo Tianci and the Qing, like in terms of, because you mentioned that he writes a memorial, so he's a Ming loyalist, but what is his actual relation to the Qing court? And is his situation like, well, I have to deal with them because of the realities of how my presence here and how I do business and so on, or how exactly does that relationship function, and how does he himself sort of see the relationship as far as we know?
That's an excellent question, and I think I guess the short answer to it is that it's very ambiguous. As with everything about Hatien, the more you research into it. But Mo Tianci actually enjoyed very friendly ties to the Qing court, despite his Ming loyalist stance. And especially as we move into the late 1760s and 1770s, because there were things happening in Siam, there was a Burmese invasion there, and the Qing was also fighting Burma. Mo Tianci was actually seeking a kind of alliance with the Qing, so that the Qing would help him out and he would actually gain more power in the region. So he actually received Qing envoys at his place. He sent memorials to the Liangguang Governor General Li Shiyao. He also directly petitioned the Qianlong Emperor. And I think his looking at his memorials, everything is I would say it's very complex, because on the one hand, he really praises the Qing. He talks about the Qing as like Tianci, as the celestial dynasty, as a superior country. He praises the Qianlong Emperor for being such a wise and benevolent ruler. But he always maintains a kind of distance, right? So in the end, the way that he dates his memorials, he never uses the Qianlong reign name. He usually does the traditional Chinese sexagenary, like Ganzhi system. And sometimes he also put the two characters Tian Yun in front of the Ganzhi. So Tian Yun, so heavenly movements. And Tian Yun is interesting because it's used a lot in the late 19th century by pro-Republican, anti-Qing revolutionaries or secret societies in Southeast Asia. And I mean, he might, Mo Tianci might be doing this as a kind of coded message of Ming loyalism. But then again, I was reading this Vietnamese source, which is a translation of the Cambodian Chronicles. And that Vietnamese source essentially says that Tian Yun is used as a kind of translation of the Cambodian calendar based on Buddha's birthday. And that's Tian Yun. And so was Mo Tianci kind of positioning himself as a, affiliation with Cambodia, maybe? Yeah, so it is, and of course the two had very close trading ties. There were many vessels from Hatien going to Guangzhou. And then later on, a lot of Hatien vessels also went as far as the Zhoushan Islands outside of Shanghai. And I think that explains why, Mo Tianci was starting to court the Shanghai literati, the people like Wang Yukun, because it went together, I think, with the business there.
No, interesting. Well, that because that would also tell us something about how the Qing kind of managed these sort of regions on the boundaries, because they seem to have then also accepted that he is kind of, because in a sense, I mean, so that if it's written so directly rather in the memorials, then they will of course have realized that he is bringing this ambiguity into so he's not like just another Qing official that writes a memoir, but he keeps that ambiguity in there. So
right.
But out of, I guess, convenience or necessity, the Qing seem to have done, well, at least accepted that.
What really struck me over the course of my research is that I was just shocked at how pragmatic the Qing are in all of their dealings. It's really impressive, and the way that they dealt with Mo Tianci. I think from the Qing official perspective, Mo Tianci was officially a part of Vietnam. Hatien was officially a part of Vietnam. But saying it's a part of Vietnam during the 18th century essentially is also very ambiguous, because there were many different centers of power, at least 2 different centers of power in Vietnam, right? And so they kind of viewed Mo Tianci, I mean, the way they characterized him was like a Tu Si chieftain, like he was like a Tu Mu. So, and his behavior kind of resembled Tu Si, multiple allegiances, kind of very hazy frontier status, things of that nature. And another thing I realized, by looking at the Qing memorials, is that the Qing actually know a lot about what is happening beyond their boundaries. Actually, a lot of the things that I couldn't find in the Vietnamese historical texts, I could find them in the Qing. And they're like intelligence reports brought by merchants to the governor generals. And the governor generals report to the Qianlong emperor, look, these things have been happening in Southeast Asia.
Interesting. Yeah, that's fascinating. We have our first question from Matthew Park. He asks, how should we understand the culture of Hatien? It sounds like they had a Chinese, meaning Confucian, Taoist, Buddhist culture, but also gave out Cambodian titles. Can we sense Cambodian realities or undercurrent from these poems?
So that's a really great question, and thank you for that. So I would say that these poems in some ways represented an ideal that Mo Tianci had, that he had this kind of vision that was inherited from his father about kind of civilizing or making Hatien a kind of Chinese cultural space. But there's idealism. There's also pragmatism. And Mo Tianci was really not lacking in pragmatism either. So if you actually look at the reality on the, and you can also see this in his poems, right? I mean, his poetry, he welcomes poets with different kinds of political persuasions. The same goes with the people in Hatien. There's a lot of Vietnamese settlers, a lot of Cambodians, a lot of Siamese. in addition to Chinese. And we're talking about Chinese, it's not just the Ming loyalists who are coming to Hatien. The majority of the Chinese immigrants going to Hatien in the 18th century came from Qing China, and they self-identified with the Qing. And so it's almost like, he really is able to allow different contradictions to coexist. And also another thing is that Mo Tianci worked very closely with the Catholic Church, with Franciscan missionaries. And the Franciscan missionaries were the key to governing the Vietnamese, because a lot of the Vietnamese who came into Hatien were actually fleeing persecution of Christianity in Cochin China, especially after 1750, I think, when the ban on Christianity was imposed.
But it's getting ever more complicated. That's fascinating. All right, yeah, thank you. Do we have any other questions?
Can I jump on the question?
Please do, John. Yeah.
Thanks. Well, it's a lovely story, and the more you talk about Hatien, the more I feel that it's more like the childhood of mine in Hong Kong. You have a change in power in the north, and you are beyond that jurisdiction, so you can be a little bit more fluid in the way you pledge your allegiance or refer to the different regimes. My question is more on the circulation of these poems beyond Hatien. How the last slide I thought was lovely, how you have these evidence of connections to different parts of southern China. Now, the people have worked on it, but then from a totally different angle, like Liam Kelly, it's more of the envoy poetry and the reception thereof. How should we think about these poems, the family, and the connections more along a different routes in terms of trade? Did they reach the same audience in China proper, for the lack of a different term at the moment? And how did they instrumentalize that particular connection?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for your question, John. And I just want to say too that your article was a very key source of inspiration for my writing, especially because of talking about multiple allegiances and trying to adopt a strategic position in regards to them. That was what initially got me thinking about all of the other aspects of my project. So in answer to your question about trade and the circulation of these poems, this is something that I still need to do more research on, and maybe I'll never be able to find out, because it just might be buried away somewhere, or some of the sources might be long lost. But what I can say is that there seems to be a lot of connection from very early on between Hatien and the literary circles of Shunde. So it seems like Shunde was maybe it's because of Chen Zhikai's background, but a lot of the Shunde-based poets ended up contributing to Mo Tianci's anthologies. And I'm not just talking about the 10 verses, and that's the most famous. There's actually several other compilations and anthologies that emerged. And you actually look at some of the names, some of the contributors, you can actually find them in the Shunde poets. And there's actually this massive compilation that came out in Guangzhou, which is called the Guangzhou Dadian, which, I saw those books, they're huge. And I don't think I can read over everything, but they do contain some of the poems of the people who contributed to the Hatien projects. So I think definitely the connection with Shunde needs to be examined further. And also the fact that these poems reached all the way to Shanghai and to Wang Yukun. And I think the precise reason why Wang Yukun was contacted was for him to act as a cultural arbiter, to judge the quality and the taste of the poetry, which is even more interesting because this is equivalent to like, our system of peer review, right? I mean, so he's this kind of, literati in China, and he becomes the adjudicator of taste, right? What poem is acceptable, what poems are not. And that's probably what got that very lofty Cambodian title, right? And then another thing about something I want to mention about Liang Wan, who is this really impoverished Sunda-based scholar, is that he not only maintained ties with Mo Tianci, he actually had a long-distance poetic relationship with a Vietnamese poet. And basically they would send a poem to each other at the beginning of each year. And the way that they identified themselves was by sending a drawing, a portrait of themselves for them to recognize each other. So I'm definitely sure that the transnational connections are there, but if what kind of cultural impact that they made in China is something that I might need to look into more.
That's fascinating. We have another question, this time from Xing. So she says, thank you very much for the interesting talk. I have a couple of trivial questions, just out of curiosity. The page of the He Yong you show us is a handwritten manuscript. Does it mean that its circulation is quite limited? Is it a 1700s manuscript or a copy of a later period? Is there a woodblocked printed edition? To say that it is a literary project, did he print these verse collections to achieve a wider circulation? Did such Guangdong literati as Chen Zikai and Liang Luan have works published in Guangdong or elsewhere in China? Somewhere you mentioned Shanghai literati, but the year is from 1756. So do you mean literatus from Shanghai County, as Shanghai as a port did not become significant until 1842?
Thank you very much. So maybe let's start with the writings themselves. So yeah, in fact, these are handwritten copies from later times. And I think Claudine Ong mentions that the original woodblock prints are no longer existent. And this is because there's been a lot of warfare that took place in Hatien, with armies. The Siamese invaded it several times, burned down the whole cities. So there's been a lot of warfare. There's been a lot of chaos. So we have this handwritten manuscript here. This is a version that I discovered in the Hanom Institute in Hanoi. But Claudine actually consulted another copy that's in the EFAO in Paris. And Chen Jinghe actually wrote an article in Japanese about these poems. And he also had access to, I think from private collectors. So even though we don't have woodblock prints, there is a lot of consistency between these different kinds of manuscripts. And so, even so many of the different contributors, there's not that much of a, there might be some characters here and there, one line might be different, but there's a remarkable degree of consistency. And how far it's spread, how big of an impact. Local Hatien-based scholars, especially Chuan Mindat, he actually says that the influence of Hatien was huge in shaping the character of the early Nguyen dynasty in Vietnam during the 19th century, where if you look at Saigon-based literati in the early 19th century, a lot of them were composing poetry and writing prose in the style of Mo Tianci. So for instance, Mo Tianci was writing about the 10 views of Hatien. There's another very famous Vietnamese official named Kinh Hoai Duc, and he actually wrote a gazetteer of southern Vietnam, and he was a leading official in the Nguyen court. And he actually wrote, I think, the 30 views of the South. So he's really kind of taking that kind of influence from Mo Tianci, and he formed his own literary society, I think consisting of 4 or 5 people, and then a bunch of other people joining in as well. In answer to the second part of the question about the literati in Guangzhou and were these works ever published, absolutely. You can find them in Guangzhou Dadian, and these are actually based on woodblock prints. And there's also other kind of compiled editions of Cantonese poetry that you would be able to consult. I mean, these are not like, like Gong Zizhen or some of the big shot Qing poets of their day. They're not that well known. They're kind of marginalized elite within China itself. Well, maybe that's the answer. To John's question as well, right? Where maybe the 10 verses didn't gain much headway in China because a lot of them are purchased by money, a lot of them circulate among the lower level elites. And then finally, Shanghai, what do we mean by Shanghai? Actually, Wang Yukun resides in Jiading County. So Jiading is outside of Shanghai, and it was a major, not the biggest, but it was a pretty major cultural center of Jiangnan during the 18th century.
Right, yeah, thank you. Do we have any other comments? Then please submit them here. I mean, Toby, if I could ask a final question, I mean, could you tell us how this generally fits into the larger project that you're doing at the moment? How Hatien and Mo Tianci fits into that?
Yeah, I think the larger work that I'm kind of conceptualizing is, Hatien as a kind of transnational space, or a kind of, to use Melissa Macaulay's words, a kind of territoriality that was founded upon trading connections, and kind of relating that to the Dutch East India Company and some of the other non-state entities that occupied territory, that waged war, that conducted diplomacy, and just kind of going into it, looking at how policies were managed, how foreign trade was conducted, and the reasons for its emergence as well as its ultimate downfall. And I think a lot of this also has to deal with, I think, your very earliest question about the relationship with the Qing state, because as practical as the Qing was, and their willingness to deal with him, they really didn't incorporate him actively in a project of expansion, right? So in other words, the Qing were very great state builders. They conducted a lot of boundary filling activities on their frontiers, but this was not the direction that they were going into. And so I'm kind of looking at that process, and then how ultimately Mo Tianci's transnationalism lost out to territoriality. Southeast Asian countries, Siam, Vietnam, who were definitely willing to territorialize these areas, along with European maritime expansion.
Mm-hmm. Oh, great! Yeah. So I think we're all looking forward to hearing more about that in the future. So unless there are any other questions, I think what remains for me to do, Xing, is to thank you very much for taking the time to give us a talk, and also to answer all our questions. So before I leave all of you, I should mention though that the next Delta on the Move lecture will take place on the 25th of November, when we'll have Dr. Yijun Wang from NYU, and she's going to talk about Chaozhou Canton and Hong Kong, the rise and fall of Chaozhou pewter workshops in Qing China. And as always, we'll be advertising these through email and social media. So please keep an eye out for that, and hopefully I'll see many of you there. But Xing, once again, thank you very much for taking the time and for giving us such a wonderful talk. And thank you to all of you for tuning in. All right. Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
See you, John.
Looking forward to joining you on one of your tours.
Oh yeah. Once the pandemic is over, let's hope that wonderful day arrives.
Well, we talked about the materiality of the poems. I would love to understand more about the tombstones as well. The tombstones you showed us, they are wonderful. I'm sure many of them are just reproductions, but then as you and I know, many of the places in Vietnam, they cannot reproduce the Chinese characters anymore. The fact that they can reproduce so many of them, there's got to be somewhat of a genealogy of the writing themselves. The one that you showed juxtaposition of the Ting and also the Yue, that was fascinating. A husband and wife belonging to different political configurations.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a lot of shocking finds. Just through field work as well as sources, which also makes the book very difficult to write. It was long in the coming, and I finally have some central ideas that I could kind of focus.
Well, looking forward to reading it.
I need to finish it. That's it.
Well, good luck with that. Thanks very much for joining us. Sorry, I cannot be with you guys for the happy events afterwards that you and Kasan will have, but we'll make up for it when either you come back to the US or I arrive in Hong Kong, whichever one comes first.
Absolutely. Great to see you.
All right. See ya.
All right. See ya.
Bye.
Bye.